The mortar and pestle ground together with a heavy rhythmic scrape, stone against stone. In the dim, drafty confines of the outer ring clinic, the sound was the only rhythm keeping the biting winter silence at bay. The wooden shutters rattled violently as another gale swept down from the jagged peaks of the Winterstone territory, forcing fine, powdery snow through the cracks. It was a place of perpetual twilight, smelling of dried sage, crushed winter lilies, and the coppery tang of old blood. Fiona Sterling did not pause her grinding. Her fingers, pale and slightly numb from the freezing ambient temperature, worked with absolute, mechanical precision. She was entirely human, wolfless in a kingdom of apex predators, which meant she felt the agonizing cold in a way the shifter population simply did not. Yet her hands never trembled. Sitting on the edge of the wooden examination table, Rory Finch watched her with a mixture of quiet awe and lingering pain. The loyal beta advisor had taken a nasty claw swipe during a border skirmish, the deep lacerations running parallel down his heavily muscled bicep. For any elite royal guard, a trip to the Grand Physician's wing in the towering Valdris Castle would be standard protocol. But Rory, like many of the lower-ranking soldiers who valued actual competence over pristine marble floors, preferred the quiet village healer. "You are pulling the stitches too tight, Fiona," the beta grunted, his jaw clenching as she reached over to wipe a bead of blood from his skin with a sterilized cloth. "I am pulling them exactly as tight as they need to be to ensure you do not tear them open the next time you decide to wrestle a rogue on icy terrain," she replied. Her voice was a calm, melodic murmur, devoid of sympathy but heavy with professional care. She maintained a rigid posture, eyes lowered, her absolute focus entirely consumed by the physical reality of the torn muscle beneath her fingertips. Rory sighed, the sound pluming into white vapor in the frigid air of the room. "The mood in the upper castle is dark today. There are whispers in the training yards. Men are falling sick, Fiona, not just colds." Something strange. Before the healer could ask for clarification, the heavy oak door of the clinic exploded inward. The wood splintered off the hinges, crashing against the stone floor with a deafening crack. The freezing blizzard rushed into the small room, instantly extinguishing the oil lamps and plunging them into shadows. Standing in the broken doorway was a massive figure, clad in the silver-plated armor of the Royal Guard. It was Bramwell Vance. The seasoned soldier did not walk in. He collapsed. His heavy armor slammed against the floorboards, the metal shrieking as he dragged himself forward by his fingertips. The scent that entered the room with him was terrifying. A suffocating mixture of rotting pine, burnt ozone, and the distinct metallic odor of decaying blood. It was a scent that spoke of unnatural corruption, of dark magic woven into the very marrow of the pack. Fiona moved before Rory even registered the threat. She dropped the bloodied cloth, sliding to her knees beside the convulsing guard. The temperature around Bram's body was unnaturally low, practically radiating a localized frost. But it was his skin that made the wolfless woman's breath hitch in her throat. Thick, jagged black veins spider-webbed up the soldier's thick neck, branching out from his collarbone and creeping toward his jawline like shattered obsidian. His eyes, usually a bright, intelligent amber, were completely rolled back, exposing bloodshot sclera. He was choking on his own saliva, his massive chest heaving in frantic, shallow spasms. "Bram!" Rory shouted, scrambling off the table and dropping to his knees on the opposite side. The beta reached out to restrain his brother in arms, but the moment his fingers brushed the infected man's armor, he yanked his hand back with a hiss. "Goddess, he's freezing. He feels like a corpse. Hold his shoulders down." "Do not let his head strike the stone," the healer commanded. The melodic softness of her voice was gone, replaced by the sharp, unyielding steel of a battlefield surgeon. She ripped open her leather medical satchel, her hands flying over rows of glass vials. She bypassed the standard painkillers and fever reducers, her fingers closing around a heavy, reinforced glass bottle. Inside sloshed a rare, faintly glowing liquid, the silver moss elixir. It was a volatile, highly concentrated draught she had spent months perfecting in secret, brewed from bioluminescent moss, scraped from the deepest caverns of the territory, and crushed winter lilies. Popping the cork with her thumb, she forced her fingers into the soldier's clamped jaw, ignoring the very real danger of his feral teeth snapping her bones. She tilted his chin back and poured a measured dose of the glowing liquid down his throat. For 3 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. The black veins continued their relentless march toward his brain. Then Bram gagged. A violent shudder ripped through his massive frame. He choked, spitting up a mouthful of thick black bile that hissed as it hit the freezing stone floor. His eyes snapped forward, pupils dilated entirely, staring up at the wooden ceiling in pure, unadulterated terror. "Fiona," he rasped, his voice sounding as though his vocal cords had been shredded by glass. "Do not speak. Breathe slowly." "Let the moss coat your esophagus," she instructed, taking a clean rag and wiping the toxic bile from his chin. She kept her movements slow, deliberate, projecting an aura of absolute safety. "No time," the soldier wheezed, his armored fingers suddenly shooting out to crush her delicate wrist in a grip fueled by pure panic. He was surprisingly strong for a dying man. "The outer barracks, 3 dozen men. It hit us an hour ago. The shadow, the dark sickness, it's tearing through the ranks." Rory's face drained of all color. "An outbreak in the containment zone. Has the royal physician been notified?" Bram coughed, a wet, horrifying sound. Dr. Drake refused to enter. He viewed from the upper parapets. He told the king it was highly contagious, incurable. The guard's eyes locked onto Fiona's, wild and desperate. "The monarch," he issued the order. "The quarantine structure is sealed. He's going to burn it." Silence. The word hung in the freezing air, heavier than the snow piling up against the broken door. A decree of fire. It was an ancient, brutal pack law, invoked only when a biological threat jeopardized the survival of the entire territory. Burn the infected alive to spare the healthy. It was ruthless. It was efficient. And it was exactly the kind of cold, tyrannical logic that Gideon Valerius operated on. Because begging wouldn't have changed the outcome in the sovereign's eyes, he simply eliminated the variable. Fiona did not gasp. She did not express horror. Instead, a terrifying, absolute calm settled over her features. She looked down at the black veins on Bram's neck. The glowing elixir had temporarily halted the spread, freezing the dark magic in its tracks, but it was not a permanent cure. She would need her lightweave seal to rebuild the cellular damage, a concentrated burst of lunar magic channeled directly through her hands. It would drain her physical reserves, pulling on her own life force to mend theirs, but she would need to do it soon. The men in that containment zone were running out of time. "Can you walk?" she asked the soldier. Rory stared at her as if she had lost her mind. "Fiona, did you not hear him? The sovereign has ordered the perimeter sealed. If the decree of fire has been given, no one crosses that line. The royal guard will execute anyone who tries to interfere." The healer stood up, her spine locking into a rigid line of defiance. She reached for her heavy woolen cloak, throwing it over her shoulders, and picked up the large, reinforced medical satchel containing the rest of her elixir supply. "I heard him perfectly, Rory," she replied, her tone perfectly flat. 3 dozen men are currently suffocating on their own blood in a locked stone box. They are my patients. I do not care what absolute decree Gideon has shouted from his warm throne room. She looked back down at the infected guard, extending a pale, steady hand. "I asked if you could walk, Bramwell." The soldier stared at her small hand, then at the fierce, unyielding light in her eyes. Slowly, agonizingly, he reached up and took it, with Rory's reluctant help on the other side. They hauled the massive, armor-clad man to his feet. "I will get you to the gates," Bram grunted, his breath rattling in his chest. "But I cannot promise they will not shoot you where you stand." "Let them try," she whispered. The journey from the outer containment zone was a blur of physical agony. The blizzard had escalated into a whiteout, the howling wind acting as a physical wall, trying to push them back into the dirt. The wolfless woman bore the brunt of the elements, her boots sinking deep into the fresh snowdrifts, her shoulders burning under the immense weight of the dying guard, leaning against her side. Every step was a battle against the cold. The frozen air burned her lungs, tasting of ice and copper. But she did not stop. She simply put one foot in front of the other, her mind cataloguing the exact symptoms she had witnessed, calculating the dosages of silver moss required to neutralize a magical contagion of this magnitude. As they finally crested the final ridge, the blinding white of the snow gave way to a violent, flickering orange glow. The containment barracks was a massive, brutalist structure of black iron and solid granite built directly into the side of the mountain. Currently, it was entirely surrounded by a ring of heavily armored elite sentinels. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their halberds planted in the snow, their faces hidden behind expressionless iron visors. Dozens of torches had been erected around the perimeter, casting long, dancing shadows that made the scene look like a descent into the underworld. The overpowering stench of refined pitch and whale oil hung thick in the air. Soldiers, carrying heavy wooden buckets, were systematically splashing the dark, viscous liquid against the heavy wooden doors and lower stones of the barracks. From inside the stone structure, the muffled, agonizing sounds of men screaming and coughing echoed into the night. It was the sound of warriors dying without honor, trapped in a cage, and standing perfectly still in the center of the chaos, entirely untouched by the frantic energy around him, was Gideon Valerius. The sovereign of Winterstone did not need a crown to announce his absolute authority. His presence alone was a crushing physical weight. He wore a long, heavy cloak of black wolf fur that swept the snow, his broad shoulders easily dwarfing the elite guards standing near him. The fierce torchlight caught the sharp, aristocratic lines of his jaw, and the terrifying, molten amber fire of his eyes. The air around the monarch literally vibrated with primal power. It smelled sharply of cedar, frost, and ozone, a scent so dominant it forced the nearby wolves to instinctively bare their necks in submission. He was a tyrant carved from ice and violence, surveying the impending execution of his own men with a face completely devoid of emotion. On his right hand, resting casually on the pommel of his broadsword, gleamed the gilded moonstone ring, the ultimate symbol of unquestionable royal command. "Light the southern wall first," Gideon's voice boomed over the howling wind. It was a deep, resonant baritone that did not require volume to demand absolute obedience. It slid into the ears of every person present like a physical command. "Ensure the roof catches quickly. I want no suffering prolonged." A captain stepped forward with a blazing torch, preparing to throw it onto the oil-soaked wood. "Stop!" The single word cut through the heavy, dominant atmosphere like a blade through silk. Gideon slowly turned his head. The molten amber of his eyes narrowed as they locked onto the small, cloaked figure emerging from the blinding snowstorm. Fiona dragged Bram the last few yards, her breath coming in ragged white plumes. She gently lowered the exhausted, gasping soldier against a snowbank just outside the ring of guards. Straightening her clothes, she adjusted the heavy strap of her medical satchel. The elite guards immediately leveled their halberds, creating a wall of sharp steel between the healer and the containment zone. The sovereign stared at her. He recognized her, of course. Everyone in the territory knew the stubborn, wolfless woman who ran the outer clinic, but no one, absolutely no one, interrupted an active royal decree. "You are trespassing in a contaminated zone, healer," Gideon stated, his voice dropping to a dangerous, vibrating growl that made the snow beneath her boots seem to tremble. "Turn around and return to your village. That is not a request." Fiona stepped forward until the tip of a guard's halberd was mere inches from her chest. She did not flinch. She did not cower. "I am here to treat the sick," she said, her voice carrying clearly over the crackle of the torches. "Call off your executioners. the contagion can be neutralized. A ripple of nervous energy passed through the ranks of the armored sentinels. Several of them looked toward their sovereign, waiting for the inevitable explosion of violence. Gideon fully turned to face her, his massive frame radiating a sudden, oppressive heat that clashed violently with the freezing blizzard. The contrast was dizzying. Snowflakes hissed and melted the second they touched his black wolf fur cloak. He took 3 slow, deliberate steps toward her. With every step, the sheer biological pressure of his aura intensified, designed to force any lesser creature to their knees. Fiona felt the blood rush to her ears. Her lungs felt tight, her pulse spiking frantically as her human instincts screamed at her to run, to hide from the apex predator stalking toward her. But beneath the terror, a strange, undeniable hum of warmth resonated deep within her chest, a bright ribbon of ancient magic, trying to pull her closer to the very man threatening her life. She forced the sensation down. Her mind, disciplined, clinical, and unbroken, refused to yield. She held her ground, lifting her chin to meet his terrifying gaze. "Doctor, Drake has already assessed the situation from the parapets," Gideon said, stopping just a few feet away. Looking down at her, he seemed massive, an immovable mountain of dark fur and authority. "The shadow sickness is magical in nature, highly virulent, and completely fatal. I will not risk the entire capital for 3 dozen men. The decree stands. Your elite physician is a coward who diagnoses from behind a stone wall because he is terrified of dirtying his hands." The woman fired back, her tone dripping with surgical precision. "He does not know what this is. I do. I have a stabilized patient sitting right there as proof." She gestured blindly toward Bram. Gideon's amber eyes flicked to the guard in the snow, noting the absence of active convulsions before snapping back to the woman. His expression remained a mask of cold stone. "A temporary delay is not a cure. I will not debate military quarantine protocols with a village herbalist. Remove her." 2 guards immediately stepped forward, their massive hands reaching to grab her shoulders. Fiona did not panic. She had anticipated the physical force. As the guards closed in, she suddenly reached into her satchel and pulled out a small, glass vial filled with a volatile white powder. With a sharp flick of her wrist, she smashed it against the iron halberd in front of her. A blinding, brilliant flash of pure magnesium light erupted in the darkness, followed immediately by a thick cloud of stinging herbal smoke. The guards shouted, dropping their weapons to cover their blinded eyes. Even Gideon instinctively raised a heavy fur-clad arm to shield his face from the sudden, overwhelming glare. It was only a 3-second window, but it was all the time her desperate, calculated mind needed. Fiona dove straight through the gap in the line. She hit the slick, icy stone of the courtyard, scrambling past the blinded sentinels. She reached the heavy iron grate of the containment barracks. The massive deadbolt was on the outside, meant to keep the men in. She shoved her shoulder against the iron, slipping through the narrow opening, just as the smoke began to clear. Reaching her hands through the bars, she grabbed the heavy iron deadbolt and, with a scream of physical exertion, hauled it across the locking mechanism. The heavy clang of iron sliding into iron echoed like a gunshot across the snowy courtyard. The smoke dissipated completely. The wind howled, whipping the flames of the torches sideways. Gideon Valerius lowered his arm. The absolute fury that rolled off his massive frame was enough to make the closest guards physically stumble backward. His molten eyes locked onto the heavy iron gate. Fiona stood on the inside of the quarantine zone. She was breathing heavily, her hands bruised from the freezing metal, her woolen cloak dusted with snow and soot. She was completely locked in, sharing the same deadly air as the 3 dozen infected, dying warriors. Gideon stalked forward until he was mere inches from the iron bars. The heat radiating from his furious body melted the snow on the metal between them. He stared down at her, the gilded moonstone ring practically vibrating with suppressed violence. "You have just sealed your own death warrant," he breathed, the words carrying the absolute, chilling finality of an executioner. I am the sovereign ruler of Winterstone. I ordered this structure burned. You are nothing but a commoner who belongs to my territory. Fiona adjusted her satchel on her shoulder. The firelight flickered across her pale, determined face, highlighting a calm so profound it felt entirely unnatural in the face of his wrath. She could feel the crushing weight of his gaze, the molten gold of his eyes promising absolute retribution. Yet, as the heat of his body washed over her, through the freezing iron bars, she did not step back. She was not used by the crown. She was not owned by the pack. She was chosen by something much older than his throne. Not used, not owned, chosen. She looked the terrifying sovereign dead in the eye, her voice utterly devoid of fear, echoing with the quiet authority of a true healer. I answer to the moon goddess's oath, the healer stated softly, turning her back on the absolute power of Gideon Valerius. Not your crown. Now, if you will excuse me, my patients are waiting. The heavy iron deadbolt, resting in its rusted bracket, was the only thing standing between the raging blizzard outside and the suffocating nightmare within. The echoing clang of the lock slipping into place had finalized the barrier. Frost crept along the edges of the metal, sealing her fate inside the tomb. Inside the quarantine barracks, the atmosphere was thick enough to choke on. The structure had been built as a military stronghold, carved entirely from impenetrable black granite, designed to withstand siege engines and elemental fury. Tonight, however, it was nothing more than a mass grave waiting for the fire. The air was stagnant, heavy with a terrifying cocktail of scents. The sharp, metallic tang of decaying blood mixed violently with the sour stench of fever sweat and the rotting pine odor unique to the shadow plague. There were no windows, only narrow archer slits high near the vaulted ceiling that allowed the freezing wind to scream through the dark stone box. The ambient temperature was plummeting, the damp cold seeping directly through the floorboards to bite at the ankles. Fiona did not allow herself the luxury of a deep breath. Her human lungs were already burning from the icy sprint across the courtyard, but she forced her respiratory rate to drop, adopting the clinical, measured breathing of a veteran surgeon entering a battlefield triage. She stood in the center of the vast, shadowy room, her eyes adjusting to the dimness. 36 cots were arranged in rigid military rows. 36 elite warriors, men who had survived brutal border wars and rogue ambushes, were currently reduced to thrashing, agonizing shadows. Men whose sheer physical presence usually commanded absolute respect were now fighting a war they could not punch or claw their way out of. The sounds of their suffering filled the cavernous space. It was a chaotic chorus of wet, rattling coughs, the violent creaking of wooden cot frames as massive bodies convulsed, and the delirious, high-pitched whimpers of apex predators whose nervous systems were being shredded from the inside out. She walked toward the nearest wall and struck a flint against the stone, lighting a single, oil-drenched lantern hanging from an iron hook. The flickering golden light cast long, distorted shadows across the room, illuminating the sheer scale of the horror. The wolfless woman pulled off her heavy woolen gloves, tucking them into her belt. Her bare fingers were already pale and stiff from the freezing draft, but she needed absolute tactile sensitivity for what was to come. She approached the first cot. The soldier strapped to the canvas was a young scout, his face contorted in a silent scream. The jagged black veins of the dark magic had already crawled past his collarbone, spider webbing across his jawline and creeping dangerously close to his temples. His skin was unnaturally cold, radiating a localized frost that coated the coarse blanket covering his chest. Opening her reinforced leather satchel, the healer carefully withdrew a glass vial of the silver moss elixir. The bioluminescent liquid sloshed inside, casting a faint, ethereal green glow against her pale skin. The scent of crushed winter lilies and raw magic briefly cut through the stench of decay, offering a temporary oasis of purity. She did not hesitate. Pinching the scout's jaw wide, with brutal efficiency, she poured a precise measure of the glowing draught over the back of his tongue, massaging his throat to force the swallowing reflex. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. The young man gagged, his spine arching off the cot as a terrifying shudder ripped through his musculature. He choked out a mouthful of thick black bile, but the healer was already there, wiping his mouth with a clean linen cloth, her movements steady and unhurried. Gradually, the frantic heaving of his chest began to settle. The black veins stopped their aggressive march toward his brain, freezing in place beneath his pale skin. The silver moss elixir was working as a suppressant, neutralizing the immediate toxicity of the magical contagion. She moved to the next cot, then the next. Outside in the blinding snowstorm, the executioners stood frozen in a state of absolute uncertainty. The elite sentinels held their unlit torches, the heavy stench of refined pitch and whale oil whipping around them in the gale. They looked toward their sovereign, waiting for the command to force open the iron gate and drag the trespassing woman out to the snow. Gideon Valerius gave no such command. The sovereign stood practically glued to the iron bars of the barracks, his massive hands gripping the freezing metal with enough force to leave permanent indentations in the steel, the heavy gilded moonstone ring scraping violently against the frosted iron as his grip tightened. The blizzard raged around him, snowflakes hissing and melting against the sheer, oppressive heat radiating from his broad shoulders. He was completely oblivious to the cold. His entire biological focus narrowed into a terrifyingly sharp point of obsession. Through the narrow gaps in the iron grate, his bright, predatory gaze tracked her every movement. He watched her work. Every breath she took plumed white in the freezing air, a stark reminder of her fragile human biology, yet her movements possessed an unbreakable rhythm. The monarch was a creature of absolute logic and ruthless efficiency. He had calculated the survival of his territory and determined that 36 lives were a necessary sacrifice to prevent the annihilation of thousands. It was a brutal equation, one he had made with a heart of stone, yet the small, fragile human, moving through the darkness of the barracks, was systematically dismantling his royal logic with nothing but glass vials and quiet defiance. She was completely unprotected, a wolfless commoner locked in a cage with feral, pain-crazed shifters who could snap her spine by accident in the throes of a convulsion. But she showed no fear. As a massive, delirious warrior suddenly lashed out, his heavy fist crashing against the stone wall mere inches from her head, she did not flinch. She simply waited for the spasm to pass, gently caught his trembling wrist, and continued her work. She refused to look up, holding her back stiff, her absolute focus entirely consumed by the physical reality of the dying men beneath her fingertips. A strange, violent sensation began to build within Gideon's chest. He pressed his hand flat against the freezing bars, the icy metal groaning under the lethal pressure. It was a physical ache, a tight, burning constriction beneath his sternum that had absolutely nothing to do with the freezing weather. The ambient scent of the shadow plague rolling out from the barracks was nauseating, but beneath it, his enhanced olfactory senses isolated a different scent. It was faint, pure, and intoxicatingly clear. Crushed winter lilies, dried sage, and the warm, undeniable scent of ozone. It was her scent. It wrapped around his primal senses, pulling at an ancient, dormant instinct buried deep within his marrow. A luminous cord of pure energy seemed to manifest in his mind, connecting the heavy, brutal weight of his royal soul directly to the quiet, determined woman wiping bile from a dying soldier's chin. The sovereign's jaw clenched. He recognized the biological symptoms. Every instinct in his blood was screaming at him to rip the iron gate off its hinges, to step into the darkness, to wrap her in his heavy fur cloak, and carry her far away from the scent of death. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The absolute ruler of Winterstone, A man who bowed to no one was experiencing the terrifying, undeniable onset of a true soul pairing, and it was anchored to the very woman who had just publicly humiliated his authority. Alpha, a hesitant voice called over the howling wind. Gideon deliberately turned his head. The commander of the Sentinels stood a few paces away, his armor coated in a thick layer of snow, holding a bucket of pitch. The structure. Do we force the lock? Gideon's eyes were completely feral, glowing with a molten, terrifying light that made the seasoned commander instinctively take a step backward. The sheer pressure of the monarch's aura exploded outward, a crushing wave of dominance that forced every guard in the courtyard to drop their gaze to the snow. "Put out the torches," the sovereign commanded, his voice a low, vibrating growl that cut through the blizzard. "Back away from the perimeter. If a single drop of pitch touches this stone, I will personally sever the hands of the man who threw it." The guards scrambled to obey, tossing their torches into the snowdrifts, where they sputtered and died in clouds of hissing steam. Gideon turned back to the iron grate, returning to his silent, immovable vigil. He watched her like a man witnessing a miracle he didn't deserve. Hours bled into the deep, unforgiving dead of night. The storm outside began to lose its initial fury, settling into a steady, freezing snowfall. Inside the barracks, the temperature had dropped to a critical low. Fiona was operating on pure mechanical endurance. Her satchel was growing light. She had administered the glowing draft to over 24 men, moving methodically up and down the aisles. The physical toll on her human body was becoming impossible to ignore. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps, pluming white in the freezing air. The cold had seeped past her woolen cloak, settling deep into her bones. Her fingers were stiff, her joints aching with a hollow, throbbing pain that made uncorking the glass vials an exercise in agony. But the real crisis was only just beginning. The silver moss elixir was a masterpiece of herbal engineering, capable of suppressing the immediate spread of the shadow sickness, but it was a temporary dam against a raging river. As she approached the far corner of the barracks, the sound of a violent, structural crack echoed through the stone room. The heavy wooden cot, holding Bramwell Vance, split down the middle. Wood splintered like kindling under the sheer force of his infected muscular spasms. The massive shifter was seizing with terrifying violence, his body arching so high his spine threatened to snap. The dark magic had mutated. The black veins on his neck were no longer merely creeping. They were actively pulsing, engorged with a sickening, toxic energy that radiated a freezing, unnatural mist. The elixir she had poured down his throat an hour ago had failed to hold the line. The contagion was inches from his heart. The healer dropped her satchel, her knees hitting the freezing stone floor as she scrambled to his side. Bramwell's eyes were wide and unblinking, locked in a terrifying stare, completely consumed by the shadow. His massive hands clawed aimlessly at his own throat, trying to tear away the suffocating darkness. There was no more time for medicine. The biological damage was too severe. She had to use the Lightweave seal. It was a dangerous, forbidden art. A raw extraction of pure magic that she was never meant to perform under such brutal conditions. Fiona stripped off her heavy cloak, letting it fall to the filthy floor. She needed absolutely no physical barrier between her and the patient. Her body was trembling from exhaustion and the biting cold, but she forced her mind into a state of absolute, crystalline focus. She placed her bare, freezing hands directly onto the center of Bram's heavily muscled chest, right over the highest concentration of the black veins. The moment her skin made contact, a shockwave of agonizing cold shot up her arms, wrapping around her own heart like a vise. The shadow plague recognized a threat and actively fought back. She closed her eyes, blocking out the sound of the wind, the groans of the dying, and the crushing weight of the sovereign watching her from the dark. She reached deep into the core of her own life force, tapping into the ancient, dormant well of lunar magic that flowed through her human bloodline. It was a heavy, dangerous extraction. She was not a shifter. She did not have a wolf to absorb the physical shock of channeling raw magic. Every ounce of energy she pushed out was pulled directly from her own marrow. "Yield," she whispered into the darkness, her voice vibrating with a sudden, unearthly resonance. A blinding, brilliant silver light erupted from beneath her palms. Outside the gate, Gideon Valerius stopped breathing. The sudden explosion of luminescence inside the dark stone box was so intense it cast sharp, pure white shadows across the snowy courtyard. The light did not flicker like fire. It poured out in a steady, liquid stream of pure, molten silver, illuminating the filthy walls and the exhausted, kneeling figure of the woman at the center of it all. He gripped the iron bars, his knuckles turning white. He could feel the sheer, overwhelming purity of the magic washing over him through the grate. It was ancient, it was divine, it was the absolute antithesis of the corrupt, decaying shadow plague. Inside, Fiona was fighting a war of attrition. The silver light flooded Bram's chest, seeping directly into his skin. The black veins writhed and fought, trying to push back against the purifying energy. A searing pain erupted behind her eyes, a sharp, splitting agony that warned her of impending physical collapse. A single drop of dark crimson blood leaked from her left nostril, splashing onto her pale wrist. She did not stop. She pushed harder, driving the lunar magic deeper into his cellular structure, demanding the darkness be unwritten. The ambient temperature around the cot began to rise, the localized frost melting into steam as the pure light burned away the corruption. With a final, desperate surge of will, the healer forced the silver light to expand outward. The black veins on Bram's neck literally dissolved. They did not retreat. They simply shattered like fragile glass under a heavy hammer, washing away into healthy, flushed flesh. The terrifying, choking rattle in his chest vanished. His massive body went completely limp, sinking into the broken cot as his lungs pulled in a deep, clean, completely unobstructed breath. He was unconscious, but he was undeniably, miraculously cured. The silver light faded, sucking back into Fiona's trembling hands. The sudden absence of the brilliance plunged the barracks back into dim, flickering lantern light. The wolfless woman slumped backward, her energy completely spent. She hit the stone floor hard, her back resting against the leg of the adjacent cot. Her chest heave, her skin deathly pale, coated in a sheen of cold sweat. She lifted a shaking hand, wiping the smear of blood from her upper lip, her eyes half closed in utter exhaustion. The silence that followed was profound. The chaotic coughing and violent thrashing in the room had significantly lessened. The patients, stabilizing as the ambient magic in the room seemed to soothe their suffering. Through the iron bars, Gideon stood absolutely paralyzed. His mind, trained for decades in the art of war and political maneuvering, struggled to process the magnitude of what he had just witnessed. His elite physician had declared the plague a death sentence. His royal council had demanded the containment zone be burned to ash. He himself had stood ready to execute 36 of his most loyal men to preserve the whole. They were all wrong. His absolute authority was wrong. The tiny, fragile commoner sitting on the filthy stone floor had just casually performed a miracle. She had not used brute force or political leverage. She had used an unbreakable will and a devastating, hidden power that made his own royal strength feel entirely inadequate. The anger that had fueled his initial confrontation with her was completely gone. The cold, tyrannical logic that dictated his every move had been shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. In their place, something far more dangerous began to rise. It was a deep, silent, terrifying respect. He stared at the single drop of crimson blood drying on her pale wrist. For the first time in his centuries of violent existence, Gideon Valerius did not know what to do. His entire empire was built on iron, frost, and absolute obedience. His laws were unquestionable, yet the wolfless woman crumpled on the floor had just rewritten the physical rules of his reality with her bare hands. The golden tether in his mind pulsed violently. A deep, agonizing pull beneath his sternum demanded he move. His wolf, a massive, scarred beast that usually only hungered for dominance and destruction, was clawing frantically at the edges of his consciousness, howling a single, desperate command. Protect. He turned his massive head, the Sovereign's glowing gaze locked onto the commander of the Sentinels. Open the gate. The commander froze, the snow piling on his heavy pauldrons. Alpha? The quarantine decree. Elderthorn, I am the decree. Gideon's voice was a lethal vibrating rumble that shook the snow from the slate eaves. Force it, or I will tear it down myself. The commander fumbled for the heavy iron ring of keys at his belt, his thick gauntlets shaking violently. He thrust the largest key into the rusted lock. It turned with a deafening, metallic screech. The heavy deadbolt slid back. Gideon didn't wait for the guards to pull the heavy iron grate wide. He shoved it inward with a single brutal thrust of his broad shoulder. The iron hinges screamed in protest as the barrier hit the black granite wall with the force of a cannon blast. The Sovereign stepped into the nightmare. The ambient temperature inside the barracks was freezing, but the stench was suffocating. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the metallic tang of sick blood, and the rotting pine odor of the shadow plague. Yet Gideon ignored it all. His entire biological focus was narrowed on the tiny, fragile figure slumped against the wooden cot at the far end of the room. He crossed the cavernous space in 3 massive strides. The delirious shifters on the surrounding cots, apex predators in their own right, whimpered and instinctively pressed themselves deeper into their mattresses. Though blinded by fever, they could feel the sheer, crushing pressure of his alpha aura. He was a predator in a room of the dying. But he wasn't there to kill. Gideon dropped to one knee on the filthy ice-cold stone floor. The impact cracked the mortar, but he didn't feel it. Up close, the physical toll she had endured was terrifying. Fiona's skin was the color of old parchment, completely drained of life, and radiating a terrifying chill. The dark smear of blood beneath her nose was a stark, violent contrast to her pale face. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, jagged gasps. She had literally burned her own life force to save his men. By degrees, hesitantly, Gideon reached out, his massive, calloused hand, stained with the blood of countless wars, hovered over her shoulder. He, who had slaughtered rogue armies without a single second of hesitation, was suddenly terrified of breaking her. His bare fingers brushed the freezing skin of her neck. The contact was explosive. A shockwave of pure molten heat ripped up his arm, traveling straight into his chest. The sacred connection snapped into place like a key turning in an ancient, rusted lock. The agonizing ache beneath his sternum vanished, instantly replaced by a rushing river of liquid silver that warmed his frozen blood. Her scent crushed winter lilies, dried sage, and the sharp, crackling scent of ozone exploded in his enhanced senses, completely overwhelming the stench of death. The word thundered through their bond like a war drum. Mine. Fiona stirred. Her dark eyelashes fluttered, revealing eyes that were dull and heavy with utter exhaustion. She looked up at the terrifying Sovereign looming over her. She didn't flinch. She didn't shrink away. Yet now, completely broken and bleeding on the floor of a mass grave, she kept her spine straight. The others, she rasped, her voice barely a whisper, her throat raw from the cold. The silver moss elixir. It only slows the decay they need. Silence. It wasn't a command of anger. It was a desperate plea. His voice, usually a weapon of mass destruction, dropped to a rough, gravelly whisper. You have done enough. I'm not finished, she argued weakly, her stubborn jaw clenching as she tried to push herself up off the floor. Her arms gave out instantly. Before she could hit the stone, Gideon caught her. He slid one massive arm beneath her knees and the other behind her shoulders, lifting her against his chest as easily as if she weighed absolutely nothing. She gasped at the sudden movement, instinctively turning her face into the crook of his neck. The heat radiating from his massive body was overwhelming, a stark, violent contrast to the freezing death she had been fighting for hours. It seeped into her aching joints, a terrifyingly gentle warmth from a man made of ice and cruelty. Gideon stood up to his full height, cradling her tightly against his heavy armor. He looked down at the cot, where Bramwell Vance lay breathing easily, the black veins completely eradicated, the absolute proof of her impossible power. The Lightweave seal, an ancient lunar magic that had not been seen in the Winterstoned territory for centuries, hidden inside the blood of a wolfless healer. The Sovereign turned on his heel and walked back toward the entrance. The sentinels in the courtyard were staring in absolute, paralyzed shock. Among them stood Rory Finch, his arm bound in a bloody sling, his eyes wide as he watched his absolute ruthless monarch willingly break his own unbreakable quarantine law. Gideon Valerius, the tyrant of Winterstone, was holding a defiant, wolfless healer against his chest, like she was the most precious artifact in the Empire. Rory, Gideon commanded as he crossed the threshold into the howling blizzard. The beta advisor snapped to attention, wincing against his injury. Alpha. Send for Dr. Drake immediately, the Sovereign ordered, his voice cutting through the gale like a broadsword. Tell him the patients in this barracks have been stabilized. He is to enter the quarantine zone and maintain their condition. If a single man dies while I am gone, or if anyone attempts to harm them, I will personally mount Drake's head on a spike at the castle gates. It will be done, Alpha, Rory shouted over the wind, a profound relief washing over his weathered face. Gideon didn't look back. He pulled his heavy, fur-lined cloak forward, wrapping it completely around Fiona, shielding her from the biting wind and the relentless snow. The blizzard raged violently around them, but inside the dark cocoon of his arms, she was surrounded by a suffocating, deeply protective warmth. She was shivering uncontrollably, the delayed physical shock of the magical extraction tearing through her nervous system. Her cold fingers instinctively curled into the fabric of his tunic, seeking the source of his unnatural heat. He watched her lean into him like a man seeing water after wandering a desert. "Hold on," he murmured into the crown of her hair, his jaw tight with a furious, protective ache. Just hold on, because letting her die was no longer an option. She had challenged his absolute control, dismantled his brutal logic, and saved his men when he was willing to burn them. And in doing so, she had unknowingly chained the beast within him. He walked toward the towering, imposing silhouette of the royal castle, every step deliberate and heavy, leaving deep tracks in the untouched snow. The journey to the inner keep was a blur of howling wind and shifting shadows. The elite royal guards at the grand oak doors scrambled to push them wide, their eyes wide with disbelief, as Gideon swept through the grand hall, ignoring the bewildered gasps of the night staff and the murmurs of the awakened courtiers. He didn't take her to the royal infirmary. He didn't hand her over to the castle healers or the frantic maids. He carried her straight up the massive winding spiral staircase, past the heavy iron-bound doors, and directly into his personal chambers. The room was a sprawling fortress of black stone and dark wood, but a massive fire roared in the enormous hearth, casting a deep, warm, golden glow across the heavy furs layered on his bed. The air smelled of cedar and the faint, lingering scent of his own dominance, but it was safe. It was a sanctuary. Gideon gently laid her down amidst the massive pelts. She looked so incredibly small, so fragile in the center of his imposing bed, yet the sheer, unbroken strength she had displayed in that freezing barracks made her the most terrifyingly powerful creature he had ever encountered. He stood over her, his chest heaving, watching her shallow breaths gradually steady in the warmth of the room. The cold, tyrannical ruler who had walked out into the courtyard hours ago was dead. In his place stood a sovereign completely stripped of his armor, a mate violently awakened, and a man utterly obsessed. She had stepped out of the shadows to challenge his reign, and in the span of a single night, she had changed everything. The massive, iron-bound door of the royal chambers clicked shut, sealing out the frantic, whispering chaos of the castle corridors. Inside, the atmosphere was a profound, almost suffocating contrast to the freezing nightmare of the quarantine zone. Here, the air was heavy with the deep, grounding scent of cedar wood, aged leather, and the crackling heat of an enormous stone hearth that dominated the far wall. The flames roared, casting a flickering, molten gold illumination across the expansive room, devouring the shadows and driving back the winter chill. Gideon Valerius did not immediately move away from the bed. The absolute sovereign of Winterstone stood completely frozen, his broad, armor-clad shoulders rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths. His enhanced predator vision was entirely locked onto the small, fragile figure buried beneath layers of heavy black wolf pelts. Fiona Sterling was unconscious, her body finally surrendering to the catastrophic physical toll of channeling pure lunar magic. Against the dark, rich fur of the Sovereign's personal bedding, her skin looked terrifyingly translucent, resembling the delicate, bruised petals of a winter lily crushed underfoot. The dark smear of dried blood beneath her nose was a violent, jarring reminder of the life force she had freely burned to save men who were not her own. Her chest rose and fell in a shallow, uneven rhythm. Gideon listened to the sound of her heartbeat. To his heightened senses, the steady, quiet thumping in her chest was the loudest noise in the entire territory. It anchored him. It pulled at the invisible tether of their fated connection that had violently awakened beneath his sternum just an hour ago. A sharp, timid knock at the chamber door broke his trance. "Enter," the monarch commanded. His voice was barely above a whisper, yet it carried the lethal, vibrating frequency of a coiled beast. The heavy wood creaked inward. The headmaid, a seasoned beta woman, who had managed the royal household for 3 decades, stepped into the room. She was accompanied by 2 younger servants. They carried heavy silver basins of steaming water, stacks of pristine white linen, and crystal vials containing the rarest restorative salves from the inner castle vaults. They kept their eyes firmly glued to the floorboards. The sheer, crushing pressure of the Sovereign's aura filling the room was enough to make their knees tremble. It was a suffocating wave of dominance, fiercely protective and wildly unstable. "My sovereign," the headmaid murmured, her voice shaking as she approached the foot of the massive bed. "We have brought the supplies you demanded. We will cleanse the healer and change her garments." His piercing golden stare snapped away from the sleeping woman and locked onto the servants. The heat in the room seemed to spike instantaneously. His jaw clenched, the heavy muscles in his neck tightening as his primal instincts aggressively rejected the idea of anyone else touching his vulnerable mate. "You will not move her," the monarch ordered, the gravel in his tone leaving absolutely no room for interpretation. "You will not attempt to dress her in castle silk. You will wash the blood from her face, and you will clean the frostbite from her hands. If you apply a single drop of salve that causes her pain, I will ensure you never step foot in this wing again. Do you understand?" "Yes, Sovereign," the maids whispered in unison, sinking into deep, submissive curtsies. Gideon stepped back, forcing himself to yield the physical space around the bed. It required a monumental effort of biological restraint. He watched with hawkish intensity as the head maid approached Fiona. The servant carefully wrung out a steaming linen cloth and began to gently dab at the dried blood on the human's pale face. Unable to stand the passive observation, the Sovereign turned his back and walked toward the far side of the chamber. He needed to shed the physical remnants of the plague zone. His hands, usually so steady in the art of war, were slightly rigid as he began to unbuckle the heavy silver-plated armor. He pulled the leather straps free, letting the massive steel chest piece drop to the stone floor with a deafening, metallic clang. He stripped off the chainmail and the ruined tunic beneath, leaving his heavily scarred, muscular torso bare to the heat of the fire. He walked to a wash basin in the corner and plunged his hands into the freezing water waiting there. He scrubbed the soot, the snow, and the lingering scent of death from his skin, but the cold water did nothing to extinguish the raging inferno inside his chest. He gripped the edges of the marble basin, bowing his head as a terrifying realization washed over him. He was a creature of absolute logic. He had built his empire on the foundation of ruthless, mathematical survival. When the shadow plague had erupted, his immediate calculation had been to amputate the infected limb to save the body. He had ordered the decree of fire. He had stood in the snow, ready to watch his own loyal soldiers burn to ash, completely convinced it was the only path forward. If Fiona Sterling had arrived 3 minutes later, if she had hesitated at the gates, if her courage had broken under the weight of his terrifying authority, he would have burned his fated mate alive. The thought struck him with the physical force of a siege weapon. A violent, involuntary shudder ripped through his massive frame. He closed his eyes, his claws instinctively extending to gouge deep, jagged scratches into the solid marble of the wash basin. The tyrant, who feared nothing, was suddenly drowning in a cold, suffocating terror. He had been entirely blind to his own catastrophic arrogance. She had not just saved Bramwell Vance and the soldiers in that dark stone box. She had saved her king from committing an atrocity that would have shattered his soul beyond repair. "My sovereign," the head maid spoke softly, breaking through the dark spiral of his thoughts. "We have finished. Her temperature is stabilizing. She is resting deeply." Gideon retracted his claws, taking a slow, steadying breath. "Leave the restorative herbs on the table, exit." The servants did not linger. They set down the remaining supplies and practically fled the overwhelming intensity of the royal chambers, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind them. The monarch grabbed a fresh linen towel, roughly drying his arms and chest before pulling on a clean, dark tunic of spun wool. He walked back to the center of the room and pulled a heavy, high-backed wooden chair directly to the side of the bed. He sat down, leaning his forearms on his knees, and settled in for the watch. The night stretched on, quiet and profound. Outside the thick glass of the arched windows, the winter storm continued to rage, hurling ice against the stone fortress, but inside, the sanctuary remained unbroken. Gideon did not sleep. He did not blink. He watched her breathe like a man, watching his own heart beat outside his chest, terrified that if he looked away for a single second, the fragile rhythm would stop. Hours dissolved into the slow grey creeping of dawn. Fiona's return to consciousness was not sudden. It was a slow, agonizing swim upward through layers of dark, heavy exhaustion. The first thing her mind registered was the complete absence of pain. The biting, freezing agony that had settled into her joints during the walk through the blizzard was gone. The sharp, splitting headache caused by the lunar magic extraction had faded into a dull, manageable throb. The second thing she registered was the heat. It was a thick, enveloping warmth that felt entirely foreign to her. She was a wolfless human living in the outer rings of a mountain territory. She was perpetually cold. But now, she felt as though she were wrapped in the very center of the sun. She slowly forced her heavy eyelids open. Her vision was blurred, taking a long moment to adjust to the ambient, golden light of the room. She was staring at a massive vaulted ceiling, intricately carved from dark wood and stone. She shifted slightly, her fingers brushing against the incredibly soft, dense texture of premium wolf pelts. This was not her rigid wooden cot in the clinic. This was not the filthy floor of the quarantine barracks. Memory rushed back in a violent, chaotic flood. The dying men, the magnesium smoke, the blazing silver light, the terrifying sovereign breaking down the iron gate. Fiona gasped, her body instinctively tensing as she tried to sit up. Her muscles screamed in protest, weak and uncoordinated. "Do not move too quickly. Your cellular structure is completely drained." The voice came from the shadows to her right. It was deep, resonant, and inherently commanding, yet stripped of the lethal hostility it had carried in the courtyard. She turned her head. Gideon Valerius was sitting mere feet away from the edge of the mattress. In the soft light of the morning fire, stripped of his silver armor and his heavy royal cloak, He looked distinctly different. The raw, terrifying size of the man was still undeniable, his broad shoulders dwarfing the heavy wooden chair, but the cold, tyrannical mask of the monarch had slipped. His face was drawn, shadows lingering beneath his molten amber eyes, betraying the fact that he had not slept a single minute. He leaned forward, reaching out to the small wooden table beside him. His massive hands, designed for wielding broadswords and breaking bones, moved with surprising, deliberate care as he poured a steaming liquid from an iron kettle into a ceramic cup. He added a pinch of dried blue leaves from the glass vials the maids had left, stirring the mixture gently. Fiona watched him, her mind struggling to reconcile the brutal executioner she had defied hours ago with the man currently brewing tea by her bedside. She pushed herself up onto her elbows, ignoring the warning ache in her spine. She kept her chin lifted, refusing to appear small or intimidated, even while trapped in his bed. "Where are my patients?" she asked. Her voice was raspy, dry as dust, but the demand in her tone was absolute. Gideon paused his stirring. He looked at her, his golden eyes tracking the stubborn, unbreakable line of her posture. "They are secure. Dr. Drake entered the barracks at my explicit command. The men are stable. The shadow plague is neutralized. You saved them." She let out a small, fractured breath of relief, the tension bleeding slightly from her shoulders. She had done it. The light-weave seal had held. The sovereign stood up, carrying the steaming ceramic cup to the edge of the bed. He did not hand it to her immediately. He simply held it out, waiting for her to acknowledge the offering. The scent wafting from the liquid was bitter and sharp, a concentrated dose of bloodroot and mountain ash, designed specifically to replenish magical exhaustion. "Drink," he instructed softly. Fiona looked from the cup to his face. The physical proximity between them was suddenly overwhelming. The sheer heat radiating from his massive frame was dizzying, and the sharp, clean scent of cedar and ozone wrapped around her senses, attempting to soothe her lingering panic. It was a biological comfort she actively tried to resist. She reached out with a trembling hand, her pale fingers brushing against his thick, calloused knuckles as she took the cup. A sudden, sharp spark of static electricity snapped between their skin. Fiona inhaled sharply, pulling the cup back. The spot where they had touched felt as though it had been branded by a hot iron. She stared at him, her human instincts screaming that something massive, something ancient, and entirely outside of her control, was shifting in the air between them. Gideon did not flinch, though a muscle feathered violently along his rigid jawline. He stepped back, giving her the physical space she desperately needed. She brought the ceramic rim to her lips and drank. The liquid was scalding and bitter, but the moment it hit her stomach, a rush of genuine, grounding warmth spread through her veins, chasing away the last lingering remnants of the magical chill. She lowered the cup, gripping it tightly with both hands to hide her tremors. "You brought me to the inner keep," she stated, her clinical mind processing her surroundings. "To your personal chambers." "It was the most secure location in the territory," the sovereign replied evenly, his arms crossing over his broad chest. "You were vulnerable. You required absolute sanctuary. I am a commoner from the outer rings. I am wolfless," she fired back, her tone sharpening with defensiveness. "My presence in the royal wing violates a dozen of your own pack laws. The council will demand an explanation." "Let them demand whatever they wish," Gideon rumbled, a dangerous, low growl vibrating in the back of his throat. "I am the law, and no one in this castle will ever question your right to be exactly where you are." Fiona set the cup down on the wooden nightstand with a sharp clack. The restorative herbs were already working, sharpening her mind and fueling the quiet, burning anger she had suppressed during the crisis. She pushed the heavy pelts off her legs and swung her feet over the edge of the bed. She was wearing her simple, linen undertunic, the heavy woolen cloak having been removed, but she refused to let her lack of armor diminish her stance. She stood up. Her legs wobbled for a fraction of a second, but she locked her knees, forcing herself to stand tall. She was significantly shorter than the towering monarch, forcing her to tilt her head back to meet his gaze, but her eyes held a fierce, unyielding light. "You rely on your absolute authority to justify every action," the healer said, her voice steady and echoing clearly in the quiet room. "You use fear because it is faster than understanding. Last night, you ordered 36 of your most loyal warriors to be burned alive in a locked box. You did not even attempt to investigate a cure." The monarch's expression hardened into a mask of stone. The accusation hit him directly in the center of his chest, precisely because it was true. "Dr. Drake is the most educated physician in the Empire. He assured me the contagion was a magical absolute, a death sentence. As the sovereign, my duty is not to individual men, Fiona. My duty is to the survival of the thousands who sleep behind these castle walls. If the rot cannot be cut out, the limb must be amputated to save the body. I made the brutal calculation so my people would not have to." "Your calculation was wrong," she snapped, stepping closer, completely ignoring the terrifying pressure of his aura. "Your reliance on a coward who diagnoses from a balcony nearly cost you your best men. Survival is not a kingdom, Gideon. It is a cage. You have built a fortress of ice and strict laws, and you have locked yourself inside it, entirely blind to the suffering of the people outside your immediate circle." He looked down at her, the golden fire in his eyes flaring. The sheer audacity of her words would have earned any other citizen an immediate execution. Yet, coming from her, the criticism did not feel like treason. It felt like a surgical blade cutting away a sickness he hadn't known he harbored. "The outer rings are freezing," Fiona continued, her voice trembling slightly with the weight of her passion. "The poor are starving, and when they fall ill to a plague they did not create, your first instinct is to erase them. You mistake cruelty for strength. But a true sovereign heals the rot. He does not simply set it on fire because he lacks the patience to find a cure." Silence descended upon the grand chamber. The crackle of the hearth was the only sound, breaking the heavy, charged tension in the air. Gideon did not argue. He did not raise his voice or project his dominance to force her into submission. He simply looked at the fierce, unbroken woman standing before him in a thin linen tunic, challenging the foundation of his entire centuries-old reign. She was physically fragile, entirely devoid of shifter strength. Yet her spirit was forged from a steel he had never encountered on any battlefield. She operated on a philosophy completely alien to his martial world. Certain injuries demanded compassion rather than force, and some fractures required immense, patient care rather than a swift swing of a sword. She had walked into a death trap, purely out of dedication to life. The monarch uncrossed his arms. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance between them until the heat of his massive body enveloped her completely. Fiona held her ground, her breath hitching slightly as she was forced to look straight up into the molten depths of his eyes. "You are right," the Tyrant King whispered. The quiet admission sent a shockwave through the room. It was not a political concession. It was a profound, personal surrender. "I have ruled with frost and iron for so long. I forgot what it means to actually protect," Gideon murmured, his voice dropping to a rough, gravelly register that vibrated straight through her bones. He raised his hand, hesitating for a fraction of a second, before gently brushing his knuckles against the soft curve of her cheek. The gesture was terrifyingly tender, entirely at odds with the lethal potential of his claws. Fiona's eyes widened, a sudden rush of heat flushing her pale skin at the contact. The invisible tether of their fated connection pulled tight, thrumming with a brilliant, undeniable energy that bypassed all of her clinical logic. "You defied my decree. You humiliated my royal guard. You dismantled my logic," the sovereign continued, his thumb slowly tracing the line of her jaw, his eyes dropping to her lips before returning to her fierce gaze. "And in doing so, you saved my men. You saved my soul from a burden I would not have survived carrying." She swallowed hard, the sharp words of her argument dying on her tongue, the absolute vulnerability in the eyes of the most dangerous man in the territory, left her completely disarmed. She had expected a fight, a clash of wills that would end with her thrown into the dungeons. She had not prepared for the Sovereign to bare his scarred throat to her. The plague did not originate naturally, Fiona managed to whisper, forcing her mind back to the medical reality of the crisis to anchor herself against the overwhelming pull of his touch. When I extracted the shadow from Bramwell's chest, I felt the signature of the magic. It was synthetic. A traitor engineered the contagion. Gideon, a traitor inside your own territories, is actively trying to murder your soldiers. The tenderness in the Sovereign's eyes vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, lethal calculation. The ruthless monarch returned, but this time, the predatory focus was not aimed at her. "Then we will find them," Gideon promised, his hand sliding to cup the back of her neck, a fiercely protective anchor. "And when we do, they will learn exactly what my cruelty looks like when it is unleashed upon my enemies. But you will never face the winter alone again." The bruised violet light of early morning crept through the thick glass of the arched windows, casting long, distorted shadows across the massive stone floor of the royal chambers. The furious blizzard that had raged through the night had finally broken, leaving behind a terrifyingly quiet, frozen world. Inside the room, the heat from the enormous hearth was a thick, enveloping blanket, but Fiona Sterling's clinical mind was already miles away, navigating the freezing, desperate realities of the outer ring. The restorative herbal tea had done its work, the dull, throbbing ache at the base of her skull, from channeling the pure lunar magic of the Lightweave seal, had subsided into a manageable pressure. The magical conduit required to draw such pure energy was incredibly demanding on a human body. Her cellular structure, completely drained mere hours ago, was slowly knitting itself back together, repairing the microscopic damage caused by acting as a living vessel for the ancient magic. She swung her legs over the edge of the massive bed, her bare feet hitting the warm wolf pelts scattered across the stone floor. The plush fur was soft against her skin, a stark contrast to the brutal, unyielding stone of the quarantine barracks. She needed to return to the quarantine zone. The shadow plague had been neutralized in the men she had treated, but the root cause of the biological attack remained entirely unknown. A synthetic contagion did not simply manifest in a locked military barracks by accident. It had been planted, it had been calculated, and as a healer, her absolute duty was not merely to stitch the wound, but to completely eradicate the infection at its source. Gideon Valerius was positioned near the heavy, iron-bound doors, fully dressed in a fresh tunic of spun black wool and heavy leather breeches. The Sovereign of Winterstone watched her every movement with a dark, hawkish intensity. The terrifying tyrant who had ordered a decree of fire the night before was gone, replaced by a mate whose primal instincts were currently warring with his rational mind. His jaw clenched tight, the heavy muscles in his neck rigid as she reached for her worn leather boots. He did not forbid her from leaving. He knew the unbreakable steel of her spine would not bend to a royal command, and he had already surrendered his absolute authority to her quiet courage. Instead, the monarch crossed the expansive chamber in 3 massive silent strides. He reached past her, picking up his own personal cloak, a massive, heavy garment crafted from the thickest black wolf fur, designed to withstand the most brutal alpine extremes. Without a single word, Gideon draped the heavy fur over her small shoulders. The sheer weight of the garment was grounding. It smelled overwhelmingly of cedar, aged leather, and the sharp, crackling scent of ozone that accompanied his dominant aura. The residual heat of his massive body clung to the lining, wrapping around her human fragility like a physical shield. He secured the heavy iron clasp beneath her chin, his large, calloused knuckles briefly brushing against her pale collarbone. A sharp spark of static electricity snapped against her skin, sending a rush of liquid warmth straight down into her chest. The golden thread of their bond pulled tight, a silent, vibrating hum that demanded she stay in the safety of his territory. Fiona forced herself to take a slow, measured breath, anchoring her mind against the biological pull of his touch. She met his molten amber eyes, offering a small, resolute nod of gratitude. Then she turned and walked out the heavy oak doors, leaving the overwhelming heat of the Sovereign behind. The descent through the Valdris castle was a stark study in absolute architectural power. The sweeping spiral staircases were carved from flawless black granite, the corridors lined with ancient tapestries and elite royal guards who snapped to rigid attention as she passed. They stared at the heavy black wolf fur dragging slightly behind her boots. The gilded moonstone ring might have been the official symbol of royal authority, but wearing the Sovereign's personal scent and armor was an undeniable declaration of supreme protection. No one dared to question her presence. As she pushed through the heavy iron gates of the inner keep and stepped out into the lower courtyards, the brutal reality of the winter hit her lungs like a physical blow. The air was thin, tasting of ice and crushed stone. The snowdrifts were waist-high in places, the world buried under a suffocating layer of blinding white. Fiona ignored the biting wind, pulling the heavy fur tighter around her throat as she navigated the winding, treacherous path down toward the outer ring. The massive stone steps of the royal descent were slick with black ice, requiring extreme caution. The village was completely desolate. The poverty here was a violent contrast to the pristine marble of the upper castle, a harsh reminder of the systemic inequality that Gideon had inherited and the council aggressively maintained. The wooden shutters of the small, cramped cottages were nailed shut against the biting cold, preventing even the smallest sliver of light from escaping into the gloom. The chimneys released only thin, meager streams of grey smoke, barely enough to keep a hearth alive. The people were hiding, traumatized by the brutal military lockdown, the violent loss of their neighbors, and the terrifying rumors of the shadow sickness that crept beneath their doors. She bypassed her own humble clinic entirely, her boots crunching heavily in the fresh snow as she headed toward the eastern edge of the settlement. Her medical logic had been churning through the variables of the contagion all night. The infected men were all elite royal guards. They shared the same barracks, the same patrol routes, and most importantly, the same localized resources. She arrived at the communal stone well that serviced the eastern military sector. It sat in a shallow depression of cracked, frost-heaved cobblestones, surrounded by the skeletal remains of dead winter pines. The heavy iron crank was frozen solid, covered in a thick layer of rime ice. Fiona dropped her reinforced medical satchel onto the snowy stones. She grabbed a heavy iron pry bar resting near the base of the well and smashed it violently against the crank mechanism. The ice shattered with a loud, sharp crack that echoed endlessly into the quiet morning. She grabbed the handle with both hands, using her entire body weight to force the rusted gears to turn. The heavy iron chain groaned in protest, slowly pulling the wooden bucket up from the dark, freezing depths of the underground aquifer. When the bucket finally cleared the stone lip, she hauled it over the edge. To a normal shifter's eye, the water inside looked perfectly clear, indistinguishable from any other frozen mountain spring. But Fiona was not looking with the eyes of a wolf. She was looking with the trained, hyper-focused vision of a master herbalist. She leaned close, her breath pluming white over the surface of the freezing liquid. There was a faint, unnatural viscosity to the water, a greasy, almost imperceptible iridescent sheen that clung to the wet wood of the bucket. Her fingers, stiff from the biting cold, unbuckled the leather straps of her satchel. She meticulously laid out her diagnostic tools on a relatively flat stone. The frigid air threatened to freeze the chemical compounds, so she had to work with absolute, unhesitating speed. She pulled out a pristine glass pipette and a small, reinforced vial containing a single drop of her highly concentrated silver moss elixir, a potent extract she had painstakingly brewed over a slow fire for 3 agonizing days. She drew a measure of the well water up into the glass tube and carefully squeezed it into the vial. The chemical reaction was instantaneous and terrifying. The liquid did not just change color, it violently convulsed. A sharp hiss erupted from the glass, accompanied by a foul, suffocating puff of grey smoke that smelled exactly like rotting pine, decayed blood, and necrotic tissue. The clear water turned completely black, coagulating into a thick, toxic sludge that stuck to the sides of the glass like a sticky, suffocating tar. It bubbled furiously for several seconds before finally settling into a dead, unnatural silence. The shadow plague was not an airborne pathogen. It was not a curse cast from the shadows. It was a surgical, systematic poisoning of the military water supply. A fascinating parlor trick, little human. The voice was smooth, cultured, and dripping with a condescending venom that made the hairs on the back of Fiona's neck prickle with alarm. She did not flinch. She carefully sealed a cork into the glass vial, securing the undeniable evidence inside her palm, before slowly turning around, 10 paces away, flanked by 2 massive, heavily scarred enforcers, was Lucian Thorn. The senior pack elder looked entirely out of place in the freezing squalor of the outer ring. He was draped in a luxurious, pristine coat of white fox fur, his silver hair perfectly slicked back, his pale, watery blue eyes completely devoid of warmth. He smelled of expensive bergamot oil, roasted meats, and beneath it all, the undeniable sickening stench of political rot. Elder Thorn, Fiona stated. Her voice was a calm, melodic murmur, perfectly flat and devoid of the terrified respect he clearly expected. Her gaze remained fixed downward, her posture uncompromising, her absolute focus entirely consumed by the physiological reality of the man positioned before her. As a master healer, Fiona did not see an untouchable politician. She saw a biological organism currently undergoing acute, poorly concealed stress. Her eyes tracked the microscopic tremors in the elder's gloved fingers, the rigid, unnatural tension locking his jaw muscles into a forced sneer. Despite the freezing alpine wind biting at their faces, a faint sheen of microperspiration had formed along Thorn's hairline. His respiratory rate was elevated, the white plumes of his breath leaving his lips in rapid, shallow bursts rather than the slow, controlled exhalations of a predator at rest. She observed his pupils. In the glaring, snow-blind reflection of the morning sun, his pupils should have been contracted to pinpricks. Instead, they were widely dilated, betraying a massive, involuntary surge of adrenaline. He was projecting extreme arrogance, an overwhelming aura of untouchable, political authority meant to shatter her confidence, but his biological tells revealed a deep, underlying panic. His heart rate was accelerating, pushing the distinct, sour metallic scent of fear sweet through his expensive bergamot cologne. He had come to the eastern well to ensure his tracks were perfectly covered, to ensure the physical evidence was utterly destroyed, only to find the kingdom's most competent healer holding the undeniable, chemical proof of his treason. Every physiological data point confirmed her precise diagnosis. Elder Thorn was terrified. The realization washed over Fiona not with triumph, but with a cold, surgical clarity. He was not a mastermind operating from a place of absolute power. He was a desperate, cornered animal whose synthetic contagion had failed to burn the barracks to the ground, leaving him exposed. "You are a long way from your dirty little clinic, herbalist," Thorn sneered, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. His heavy boots crunched loudly on the ice. "The Sovereign may have dragged you into his bed in a moment of temporary madness, but do not mistake his fleeting gratitude for actual power. You are wolfless, you are fragile, you have absolutely no business investigating matters of state." "A poisoned well is not a matter of state, Elder," the healer replied, her tone carrying the sharp, unyielding steel of a surgical blade. "It is a matter of sanitation, and currently I am looking at the largest piece of filth in the territory." The two massive enforcers behind Thorn instantly bared their teeth, low, guttural growls vibrating in their thick chests. Thorn held up a gloved hand, silencing his hounds. His pale eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. He stepped directly into her personal space, attempting to use his dense, suffocating alpha aura to force the human to her knees. The atmospheric pressure around them spiked, a heavy, crushing weight designed to break the will of lesser creatures. Fiona felt the air leave her lungs. Her human heart hammered frantically against her ribs, her primal instincts screaming at her to drop her gaze and submit to the apex predator, but she did not yield. She drew upon the residual, grounding heat of the heavy black cloak wrapped around her shoulders. She breathed through the crushing weight, her mind locking into a state of absolute, clinical defiance. The decree of fire was meant to cleanse this territory of weakness, Thorn whispered, his face inches from hers. "You ruined a necessary pruning. The Royal Guard needs to be reminded who truly holds the ancient power in Winterstone, and Gideon needs to learn that his crown is only worn by the grace of the Council. You are a loose thread, Fiona Sterling. And accidents happen so very easily to fragile things wandering alone in the snow." He reached out, his thick, leather-clad fingers aiming to grab her jaw. The moment his glove brushed against the thick fur of the royal cloak, a violent realization hit the corrupt elder. He froze. His pale eyes widened a fraction of an inch as his olfactory senses finally bypassed the freezing wind and registered the overpowering, lethal scent embedded deep within the fabric. It was the pure, unadulterated scent of the sovereign. It was a territorial mark so profound, so violently possessive, that Thorn instinctively recoiled, snatching his hand back as if he had just touched a burning coal. Fiona watched the sudden, pathetic retreat with cold, analytical eyes. She carefully tucked the glass vial of black sludge into her reinforced satchel, pulling the heavy leather strap securely over her shoulder. "The shadow plague is not a wolf, Elder," she said softly, turning her back on the absolute corruption of the council member. "It is a coward's poison, and a coward's poison always leaves a stain." She did not wait for a response. She simply walked away, leaving the corrupt elder rooted paralyzed in the freezing snow, entirely aware that his execution had just been set in motion. The journey back to the towering fortress of Valdris felt entirely different. The biting wind still howled off the jagged peaks, but the cold no longer penetrated her skin. She moved with absolute, mechanical precision, her mind rapidly categorizing the chemical components of the sludge, formulating the exact testimony she would need to present. Every step she took away from the squalor of the outer ring was a step closer to dismantling the rotting foundation of the council's authority. She bypassed the Grand Infirmary and the lower council halls, marching straight toward the heavily guarded doors of the Royal War Room. The elite sentinels recognized the Sovereign's cloak and immediately stepped aside, hauling the massive oak doors open without a single word of protest. The war room was a sprawling, circular chamber, dominated by a massive slate table carved with the exact topographical map of the Winterstone territory. The air was thick with the scent of burning logs, melting snow, and the heavy, tense atmosphere of military crisis. Ancient banners hung from the stone walls, their sigils faded from centuries of brutal conflict, silent witnesses to the devastating toll of the shadow plague. Gideon was leaning over the slate table, his massive hands braced against the stone edge as he stared down at the carved wooden markers representing his decimated guard patrols. Positioned across from him was Rory Finch, the beta advisor's arm heavily bound in a fresh white sling. Rory was giving a quiet, grim report on the border perimeters, his voice tight with exhaustion. The moment Fiona stepped over the threshold, the heavy oak doors closing with a resounding thud behind her, the entire dynamic of the room fractured. Gideon's head snapped up. His fierce golden irises locked onto her, and for a fraction of a second, an expression of profound, soul-deep relief flashed across his face. But that fleeting vulnerability was instantly annihilated by a terrifying feral rage as his supernatural senses engaged. The ambient temperature in the war room plummeted for everyone else, yet spiked into a suffocating, blistering heat around the monarch. His nostrils flared wildly, his enhanced senses ripping through the clean, crisp scent of the winter snow, clinging to her cloak, locking directly onto the foul, lingering odor of bergamot and political rot. Out! The Sovereign's voice was a low, vibrating rumble that physically rattled the glass lanterns hanging from the iron chandeliers. Rory did not hesitate. The beta advisor snapped his mouth shut, offered a sharp, frantic bow, and practically sprinted from the room, pulling the side door shut behind him. Gideon crossed the stone floor in an instant. He did not walk. He stalked, a massive beast of ice and violence, completely consumed by the sudden, terrifying jealousy of a mate whose territory had been breached. He stopped mere inches from her, his broad chest rising and falling in heavy, jagged breaths. "Why is the scent of a corrupt elder on your skin?" he demanded. His claws instinctively extended, the sharp black talons gouging deep, permanent trenches into the solid stone floor beneath his boots. "Why do you smell of Lucian thorn?" Fiona did not shrink back from the lethal fury radiating off the tyrant king. She calmly reached into her satchel, unbuckled the reinforced leather flap, pulled out the glass vial of coagulated black sludge, and reached past his massive frame to place it directly onto the center of his topographical war map. The glass clinked softly against the slate, a tiny, fragile object holding the absolute destruction of a senior pack elder. "I smell of him because he cornered me at the eastern well in the outer ring," she stated, her voice a beacon of absolute surgical calm in the center of his storm. She unfastened the heavy iron clasp at her throat, letting his fur cloak slide off her shoulders and onto a nearby wooden chair. He came to inspect his work. I came to gather the evidence. Gideon stared at the vial of black sludge resting precisely on the carved marker of the eastern barracks. The feral jealousy in his eyes froze, rapidly shifting into a cold, terrifying calculation. "I will burn the entire kingdom to the ground before I allow that to happen," the monarch breathed, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper that promised absolute, uncompromising slaughter. He turned his massive head to look down at her, the golden thread of their bond pulsing with a violent protective ache. "He threatened you, in the snow, alone. He attempted to intimidate me," Fiona corrected softly, stepping closer to the war map. "He failed. Look at the water supply, Gideon. The eastern well feeds exclusively into the lower quarantine barracks and the canteens of the outer guard patrols. The civilian sector draws from the western river. This was never a random outbreak. It was a highly concentrated, surgical strike designed specifically to cripple your military strength and force you to execute your own loyal men." The Sovereign of Winterstone gripped the edges of the slate table. The raw, terrifying intellect of the woman beside him was staggering. For centuries, he had surrounded himself with elite generals, ancient council members, and scholars who merely echoed his own brutal logic. Yet here was a wolfless human, operating entirely outside his military hierarchy, dismantling a treasonous conspiracy with a single glass vial and an unbreakable will. He looked at her bruised, pale hands resting on the edge of the map. He saw the faint tremors she was desperately trying to hide, the lingering physical exhaustion of channeling the lunar magic of the Lightweave seal. The absolute ruler, a man who had built an empire on the ruthless application of fear and sharp steel, realized in a single profound heartbeat that his entire methodology was flawed. A broadsword could not cut the shadow plague from a man's veins. Fear could not purify a poisoned well. He reached out, his massive, calloused hands gently wrapping around her freezing, trembling fingers. He pulled her hands away from the cold slate, pressing them flat against the center of his chest, right over the heavy, steady thumping of his own heart. The overwhelming heat of his body seeped into her aching joints, a terrifyingly tender gesture from a monarch capable of tearing a man in half. Only deep affection could mend the deepest of scars. The silent realization crashed through the sovereign's soul, shattering the last remnants of the ice he had encased his heart in for decades. He looked down into her fierce, unyielding eyes, seeing the absolute equal that fate had dragged into his frozen world, not a subject to be ruled, not a fragile thing to be locked away in a tower, but a true partner whose quiet light was the exact counterbalance to his violent darkness. She was neither a pawn nor a possession, but an equal partner. "We cannot simply execute him in the shadows," Fiona murmured, her voice softening as the ambient heat of his chest began to melt the last traces of the winter chill from her bones. "Thorn holds too much influence over the upper nobility. If you tear his throat out without public proof, they will call it tyranny. They will fracture the pack. Then we will not use the shadows," Gideon promised, his thumbs slowly, reverently tracing the pale skin of her wrists. The terrifying molten gold fire in his eyes was completely steady, burning with a newly forged purpose. "I will summon the Grand Royal Council. I will force Thorn into the center of the Great Hall, surrounded by the very men he sought to control. And you, Fiona Sterling, will remain at my right hand and expose his cowardice to the light." It was a dangerous, unprecedented strategy, placing a wolfless commoner on the royal dais to accuse a senior pack elder would ignite a political firestorm that could tear the architecture of the Winterstone court apart. It would paint a massive, undeniable target on her back. Fiona did not hesitate. She looked up at the towering, lethal sovereign who was currently treating her scarred hands like they were the most precious artifacts in the Empire. She felt the heavy, undeniable gravity of their soul pairing locking into place, forging a connection that was entirely rooted in profound, mutual respect. "I would rather burn with you than freeze alone," she whispered, her voice echoing with the quiet absolute authority of a queen. The monarch bowed his massive head, resting his brow gently against hers. The raw, violent beast inside him purred, finally silenced by the soothing, brilliant light of his mate. The war for the survival of the pack was no longer being fought in the dark, and the true trial of Winterstone was about to begin. The royal throne room of Valdris was a cavernous expanse of black marble and ancient ice, designed centuries ago to intimidate foreign emissaries and crush the spirits of dissenting lords. Colossal pillars of polished obsidian stretched toward a vaulted ceiling lost in the shadows, while heavy iron chandeliers cast a flickering, nervous illumination over the assembled nobility. The air inside the chamber was incredibly dense, suffocating under the combined weight of 1,000 anxious breaths and the overwhelming territorial dominance radiating from the dais. Gideon Valerius sat upon the Lycan throne. He did not lounge, nor did he lean against the heavy carved stone. The sovereign sat perfectly rigid, his massive hands resting flat against the armrests, his broad shoulders squared in a posture of lethal, absolute readiness. He wore no armor today, only a stark tunic of midnight wool that clung tightly to his heavily muscled chest, yet he looked more dangerous than a warlord on a blood-soaked battlefield. His molten amber eyes were completely devoid of warmth, sweeping over the crowded floor with a terrifying, calculated precision that made the high-ranking alphas in the front rows instinctively lower their gazes. Standing a few paces below the royal dais, entirely isolated from the shifting, whispering masses of the elite, was Fiona Sterling. She wore a simple, unadorned dress of deep forest green, the heavy fabric, thing offering little protection against the ambient chill of the grand chamber. The heavy black wolf fur cloak the monarch had wrapped around her hours earlier had been left in the war room. Here, before the judgment of the Grand Council, she refused to hide behind the physical shield of his scent. The elite courtiers, draped in velvet and rare silks, cast sidelong glances at her, their whispers carrying the sharp, unmistakable sting of aristocratic disdain. They smelled of expensive perfumes, roasted meats, and the sour, metallic tang of political panic. To them, she was a wolfless anomaly, a fragile commoner who had somehow bypassed the ancient hierarchy to stand at the right hand of their untouchable king. As the derogatory murmurs regarding her bloodline rippled through the front rows, the healer did not flinch. She kept her head bowed and her spine straight, her absolute focus entirely consumed by the glass vial resting on a velvet-draped pedestal in the center of the room. Inside the reinforced glass, the coagulated black sludge sat completely inert, a silent, toxic proof of the betrayal rotting the foundation of the empire. The heavy oak doors at the far end of the hall groaned open, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the sudden silence. Lucian Thorne walked down the central aisle. The corrupt elder was not in chains. He moved with the slow, arrogant glide of a man who believed his political armor was entirely impenetrable. He wore his pristine white fox fur coat, his silver hair immaculately styled, his pale, watery blue eyes projecting an aura of aggrieved innocence. He was flanked by his personal enforcers, though they were forced to stop at the edge of the judging circle. Thorne stepped into the center of the room, offering a shallow, perfectly executed bow toward the throne. "My sovereign," the politician began, his voice smooth and echoing with practiced reverence. "I was summoned from my estates with shocking urgency. The guards mentioned an inquiry regarding the quarantine zone. I am, as always, entirely at your disposal to aid in navigating this tragic biological crisis." Gideon did not immediately respond. The silence stretched, heavy and oppressive, forcing the older man to stand in the uncomfortable void. The ambient temperature around the throne plummeted, a localized frost creeping down the stone steps of the dais. "There is no biological crisis, Elder." The tyrant king finally spoke, his deep, vibrating baritone rolling over the crowd like a physical shockwave. "There is only treason." The monarch raised a single, scarred finger, pointing toward the pedestal. "The shadow sickness that nearly decimated my outer guard patrols was not a natural contagion. It was a synthetic poison deliberately introduced into the eastern communal well. The concentrated residue sits before you." Thorne turned his head, his pale eyes flicking toward the glass vial, and then, with profound dismissal, toward the woman standing near the steps. A patronizing, pitying smile curled the edges of his thin lips. He looked back to the throne, projecting the exhausted patience of a parent dealing with a confused child. "Alpha," Thorne sighed, his tone dripping with condescending sorrow. "I understand the terror this plague has instilled in the lower rings. Panic breeds wild accusations. But we are men of logic, grounded in the ancient bloodlines of Winterstone. Are we truly meant to dismantle the Royal Council based on a vial of swamp mud presented by a wolfless village herbalist? This woman has no wolf. She has no understanding of high-level pack magic. She is merely desperate to elevate her social standing by inventing a conspiracy where there is only a tragic, natural disease." A ripple of agreement washed through the nobility. Several senior lords nodded, their primal instincts aligning with the familiar comfort of pack hierarchy rather than the terrifying prospect of internal sabotage. The atmosphere in the room shifted, the collective suspicion turning heavily toward the fragile human who dared to accuse a pure-blood elder. Fiona felt the crushing weight of 1,000 hostile stares pressing down on her shoulders. Her human heart accelerated, a natural biological response to being surrounded by apex predators preparing to close ranks. But her clinical mind remained absolute, a fortress of pure, unyielding ice. She did not wait for Gideon to defend her. She stepped forward, leaving the protective proximity of the dais, and walked directly toward the center of the judging circle. Her boots clicked sharply against the black marble, a steady, unbroken rhythm that commanded the attention of the sprawling room. A master healer does not need a wolf to recognize the stench of a coward's poison, the woman stated, her voice a melodic, piercing calm that sliced effortlessly through the political tension. She stopped mere inches from the velvet pedestal, turning her fierce, uncompromising gaze entirely upon the politician. "You rely on your bloodline to shield you from scrutiny," she continued, her tone holding the precise, surgical detachment of a doctor diagnosing a fatal tumor. "You believe that because these lords cannot smell the dark magic beneath your expensive bergamot oil, it does not exist, but the shadow plague leaves a biological footprint. It alters the cellular structure of everything it touches, including the hands of the man who poured it into the aquifer." Thorne's patronizing smile completely vanished. The microscopic tremors she had observed at the well returned, his gloved fingers twitching violently against his sides. "You speak treason, human. I will not stand here and be insulted by a commoner who belongs in the dirt." "Then do not stand," Fiona whispered. She reached out with both hands and firmly grasped the reinforced glass vial containing the black sludge. The crowd collectively gasped, bracing for a toxic explosion, but the healer simply closed her eyes. She bypassed her own physical exhaustion, reaching deep into the ancient, dormant well of lunar magic that flowed through her human veins. She did not pull the massive, blinding surge required for the lightweave seal that had cured Bramwell Vance. Instead, she summoned a highly concentrated, surgical thread of pure silver light. The magic bled through her pale skin, illuminating her fingertips with a brilliant, molten glow that cast sharp, pure white shadows across the marble floor. The moment the divine energy breached the glass, the toxic residue inside reacted violently. The black sludge hissed, boiling upward, as it desperately tried to escape the purifying light, but Fiona did not destroy it. Using her absolute will, she forced the lunar magic to act as a diagnostic catalyst. The pure light struck the dark magic, forcing it to reveal its energetic tether. A sudden, sharp crack echoed through the silent hall. A thick, undulating tendril of black mist violently erupted right through the sealed cork of the vial. It did not dissipate into the air. Driven by the irrefutable laws of magical resonance, the dark mist shot across the 10 paces, separating the pedestal from the corrupt elder. It slammed directly into Thorne's chest, wrapping tightly around his wrists and forearms like a heavy, suffocating chain of smoke. Wherever the black mist touched him, the pristine white fur of his coat began to instantly rot, turning a sickly, necrotic grey. The expensive leather of his gloves withered, exposing the skin beneath, skin that was currently glowing with the exact terrifying, jagged, black veins that had choked the dying soldiers in the quarantine barracks. The undeniable visual proof of his treason was literally chained to his body. Absolute, horrified pandemonium erupted in the royal throne room. The senior lords, who had just nodded in agreement with him, now stumbled backward in pure terror, tripping over their heavy velvet cloaks to get away from the infected politician. The enforcers flanking him took one look at the black veins pulsing on their master's skin and immediately dropped their halberds, backing away with their hands raised in panicked surrender. Thorne screamed. It was a high, pathetic sound of a cornered rat. He clawed frantically at his own forearms, desperately trying to wipe away the glowing black veins, but the magical stain was burned into his cellular structure. The shadow he had engineered to murder the royal guard had finally been dragged into the light. It was meant for the outer ranks. The elder shrieked, his composure completely shattering as he fell to his knees on the freezing marble. His watery blue eyes darted wildly around the room, seeking a single ally among the terrified nobility. They were weak. The pack was growing stagnant under a king who refuses to expand our borders. I was culling the frail to force a mobilization. I did it for Winterstone. A deafening, terrifying roar shattered the acoustics of the grand chamber. It was not a shout. It was the pure, unadulterated sound of an apex predator completely unleashing his feral wrath. Gideon Valerius did not step down from the dais. He practically teleported across the distance, moving with a speed that defied his massive size. He bypassed Fiona entirely, a blur of dark wool and lethal intent, and slammed his heavy boot directly into the center of Thorn's chest. The corrupt elder was launched backward, sliding violently across the polished marble until his spine crashed against the base of towering obsidian pillar. The sound of breaking ribs echoed sharply. The tyrant king stalked forward, the sheer biological pressure of his aura exploding outward. It was a crushing, suffocating wave of absolute dominance that forced every single shifter in the cavernous hall to instantly drop to their knees. The elite guards, the high-ranking alphas, the wealthy lords, all of them hit the floor, their heads bowed, their throats completely exposed to the wrath of their sovereign. Gideon stood over the broken, gasping politician. The molten amber fire in his eyes was blinding, radiating a heat so intense it melted the frost off the nearby stones. He reached down, his massive hand closing around Thorn's throat, and hauled the man effortlessly off the floor, holding him suspended in the air. "You dared to cull my men," the monarch whispered. The gravelly, vibrating frequency of his voice was so low it shook the dust from the ancient banners hanging above. "You poisoned the water of the warriors who bleed to keep you safe in your silk sheets. You used dark magic to fracture my territory, and then you dared to threaten my mate in the snow." Thorn choked, his face turning a mottled purple as his legs kicked uselessly in the air, his hands clawing weakly at the sovereign's impenetrable grip. By the ancient laws of Winterstone, the penalty for treason is a swift execution by the king's blade, Gideon declared, his voice rising to boom across the kneeling, terrified masses. But a coward's poison does not earn a warrior's death. The monarch sneered, a terrifying expression of pure, calculated cruelty. He violently threw the elder back onto the marble floor. Thorn hit the stone hard, coughing up a spatter of dark blood as he curled into a pathetic, trembling ball. "Tear off his furs," the tyrant commanded, gesturing sharply to the elite guards, who were slowly rising from their submissive postures. "Revoke his titles, his lands, and his wealth. Escort him to the northern border of the territory. Throw him into the howling wastes with nothing but the linen on his back. Let him see how long his political influence keeps him warm when the blizzard comes to claim him." "No!" Thorn begged, spitting blood onto the pristine floor. "Alpha, please!" The cold. "It is a death sentence. Have mercy. I showed you exactly as much mercy as you showed the men suffocating in the quarantine barracks," Gideon replied, his tone devoid of any emotion. He turned his back on the broken man. "Remove this filth from my sight." The elite sentinels did not hesitate. They grabbed the screaming, thrashing elder by his arms, dragging him brutally across the marble floor. The heavy oak doors swung open to receive him, and within seconds, the traitor's cries were swallowed entirely by the howling winter wind outside. The doors slammed shut with a deafening finality. The shadow was broken. The political rot had been excised with absolute precision. The royal throne room remained utterly silent. The kneeling nobility did not dare to move, their eyes fixed firmly on the floorboards, completely terrified of the sovereign's lingering wrath. They had witnessed the absolute destruction of one of the most powerful men in the empire, dismantled not by a rival army, but by a single vial of water and the quiet, unbreakable will of a village herbalist. Gideon took a slow, deep breath, forcing the violent, feral beast inside his chest to retract its claws. The crushing pressure of his dominance slowly receded from the room, allowing the terrified courtiers to finally draw oxygen back into their burning lungs. The monarch turned around. His molten eyes immediately sought out the small, fragile figure standing near the velvet pedestal. Fiona was leaning heavily against the stone base, her breathing shallow. The surgical extraction of the lunar magic had cost her, a fresh wave of physical exhaustion causing her pale hands to tremble slightly. But as the towering king approached her, the heavy boots echoing in the silent hall, she did not lower her gaze. She met the fire in his eyes with the steady, calm light of a woman who had just saved an empire. Gideon stopped in front of her. The contrast between them was stark. The massive, scarred warlord, forged from ice and violence, and the delicate, wolfless human whose hands held the power of the divine. He did not speak to her privately. He slowly turned to face the sprawling, silent hall, making sure every single lord and general was watching. "Rise," the sovereign commanded. The nobility scrambled to their feet, their heavy velvet cloaks rustling nervously. They stood at rigid attention, waiting for the final decree. Gideon reached out his massive hand, his long, scarred fingers gently wrapping around Fiona's trembling wrist. He did not pull her. He simply offered the physical support of his immense strength, anchoring her against the lingering exhaustion. For centuries, this court has worshipped the strength of the wolf. The monarch's voice rang out, clear and undeniably absolute. "We have elevated purebloods and marginalized those without a beast, believing that the capacity for violence was the only true measure of worth. We were entirely blind. The strength that saved Winterstone today did not come from fangs or claws. It came from a quiet, unbreakable courage that none of you possess." He lifted her hand slightly, the gilded moonstone ring on his own finger catching the light of the chandeliers. "Fiona Sterling is no longer a commoner of the outer ring," Gideon declared, the golden thread of the mate bond vibrating with a triumphant, overwhelming resonance between them. "She is the grand physician of the Valdris court. Her medical decrees carry the exact weight of my royal command. Whoever questions her authority questions my crown." Furthermore, the Tyrant King paused, turning his massive head to look down into Fiona's wide, stunned eyes. The cold, impenetrable mask of the ruler completely melted away, revealing a man utterly devoted, a mate entirely consumed by a love he had never expected to find. "She is my chosen mate," Gideon whispered, the words echoing through the cavernous hall like a sacred oath. "She is the Luna of Winterstone, and she will never bow to anyone in this territory again." A profound, breathless shock rippled through the nobility. The absolute ruler of the North, a man who had rejected dozens of elite pure-blood suitors for decades, was publicly claiming a wolfless human. But after witnessing the terrifying display of divine magic and the total dismantling of a corrupt elder, there was no dissent. There was no whispered prejudice. As one singular, unified entity, the entire Grand Council of Winterstone dropped to their knees. The heavy clatter of armored guards hitting the floor joined the rustle of silk. 1,000 powerful predators bowed their heads in absolute, unquestioning submission to the quiet village healer. Fiona stared out at the sea of kneeling nobility. The very people who had looked at her with disdain just an hour ago were now completely surrendering to her authority. The overwhelming realization of her new reality washed over her, but it was not the political power that made her breath hitch. It was the heavy, incredibly warm hand wrapped around hers, the steady, grounding presence of the man who had torn his own rigid world apart to stand beside her. She hadn't been claimed as a prize. She had been recognized as his true equal. The heavy iron doors of the royal throne room were finally thrown open, but this time it was not to banish a traitor. The bright, blinding light of the midday sun poured into the dark, cavernous room. The furious blizzard had completely broken, leaving behind a sky of crisp, flawless azure. Hours later, the suffocating political theatre of the Grand Court had been left far behind. The royal chambers at the highest peak of the Valdris castle were quiet, insulated from the frantic, joyous restructuring happening in the outer rings below. Orders had already been dispatched. The quarantine zone was being dismantled, the heavy iron grates melted down to forge new plows for the spring. Wagon loads of premium supplies, thick furs, and clean, untainted water were flowing steadily down the mountain, personally escorted by the elite guards, who now viewed their new Luna with a reverence bordering on religious awe. Fiona stood on the expansive stone balcony of the bedchamber, her hands resting on the freezing marble balustrade. She was wrapped entirely in Gideon's massive black wolf fur cloak, the heavy garment pooling around her boots. From this incredible vantage point, she could see the entire expanse of the Winterstone territory. The thin, meager trails of grey smoke that usually characterized the outer ring had vanished. Instead, robust, healthy fires burned bright in the village hearths, a warm, flickering sign of a kingdom that was finally beginning to thaw. The soft, heavy click of boots on stone signaled his approach. Gideon stepped out onto the balcony, the freezing alpine wind immediately ruffling his dark hair. He moved with a terrifying silence for a man of his immense size, stopping directly behind her. He did not say a word. He simply wrapped his massive arms around her waist, pulling her back flush against the solid, impenetrable wall of his chest. Fiona leaned into the embrace immediately, her head resting back against his shoulder. The sheer heat radiating from his body was a localized sun, completely neutralizing the biting cold of the mountain air. She closed her eyes, letting the heavy, grounding scent of cedar, aged leather, and crackling ozone fill her lungs. The frantic, exhausting war of survival she had fought for days was finally over. The deep, throbbing ache of channeling the lunar magic was fading, replaced by the soothing, liquid warmth of the mate bond, actively knitting their souls together. "The eastern well has been permanently sealed," Gideon murmured, his deep voice vibrating directly against her spine. "Dr. Drake has been dismissed from the castle and sent to manage a border outpost. Rory Finch has been promoted to captain of the guard. The rot has been entirely burned away, my queen." "Healing takes time, Gideon," she replied softly, her small hands coming up to rest over the thick, scarred forearms wrapped around her waist. "The physical sickness is gone, but the division between the upper castle and the outer rings will not vanish overnight." "Then we will bridge it," the sovereign promised, his grip on her tightening with an absolute, unyielding devotion. Stone by stone, together, she had stepped into the freezing darkness to challenge an absolute tyrant, armed only with her quiet courage and a healer's unbreakable vow. In doing so, she had not merely cured a dying pack, she had healed the scarred soul of a king, claiming her rightful place as the true, undisputed Luna of Winterstone. "Thank you for joining our sanctuary tonight." She stepped at once, believing herself unworthy. She will never step aside again. Let me know in the comments below. Where are you listening from tonight? Did the king grovel enough for your satisfaction? Subscribe to join our pack for more stories of quiet strength and absolute devotion.